Hello everyone, hope you all had a great Monday. As for me, it was rainy and cold, but puts me in the mood for spooky places. And this week we shall visit a few places in Kansas. And our first stop is Fort Riley, Kansas. According to some, Fort Riley, Kansas is one of the most haunted of our old military installations. This fort and others like it were once located on the edge of the wild plains of the West and were the last refuge for many travelers and settlers heading out into the wilderness. They were also staging areas for the Army's bitter campaign against the American Indians, leading to tragedy and death. Because of this, these forts, still in use today, have become well known as places where the dead do not rest easily. These stories all take place around Fort Riley, a historic place in its own right, and post that once served as home to General George Armstrong Custer. Custer and his wife Libby resided at the fort with the 7th Cavalry Regiment between 1866 and 1867. It is no surprise to hear that Custer's ghost has been spotted at the fort and his former residence on Sheridan Avenue. There's been some confusion as to where exactly Custer lived while stationed at Fort Riley, but Quarters 24 had been renovated and named the Custer House. It stands today as a museum to the life of the fort in its late 1860s. Ghost stories and strange tales abound at the house, whether because of Custer or because of the history of the house is unknown. The building is a limestone structure and one of the 4 buildings that remain from the 1850s. It was used for over 120 years until 1970s when it was turned into a museum. The stories have been a part of the house, part of the fort itself since at least 1855. It was in this year that the first cholera epidemic hit the fort and claimed many lives. According to legends, not all of the victims of the horrible disease chose to rest in peace and have wandered the grounds of the fort ever since. Also should be known that limestone is a great conductivity of paranormal activity, some studies state. Another famous ghost of the fort is one whose source can also be traced back to the 1860s. It seems that a woman who was living in quarters 124 at the time drowned herself in a well on the fort grounds. Her body was buried in an open pasture behind the house, and that pasture is now someone's backyard. About 70 years later, another woman living in the quarters began reporting horrible noises in her house at night. She described them as being unbearably loud and sounding as though someone was dragging a wooden box up and down the stairs with chains. The sounds continued night after night, and finally a priest was called in to do an exorcism. The ceremony was apparently successful for a while, but years later the ghost returned to wreak havoc again. The stories continue to be told for some time, but she apparently has not been heard in some time now. Another haunted place on the grounds of the fort is said to be the lower parade ground. Those who have gone there early in the morning claim to have seen a lone rider who gallops madly across the field and then disappears. There is no clue as to who the man might be, but he has been seen there for many years. Many years ago, when the cavalry still used horses, soldiers patrolled the pastures lands around the fort buildings. It was said that one of the shacks was haunted by a ghost who was often heard there, but never seen. Soldiers who bunked there for the night would hear the outside door open and would hear an invisible presence come inside. When they would go to check on the sounds, they would discover there was no one else present. And another horse-related story. In involves the #1 stable, where the soldiers on the night duty would report seeing a man in old-fashioned clothing ride through the stable and then disappear. Years later, when work was being done to the stable, the skeletons of horse and rider were found in an old ravine. Could this be the man who had been seen riding there? Now we move on to Theorosa's Bridge near Valley Center, Kansas. There is a small town located just north of Wichita called Valley Center. Several miles outside of town along the old country road is a plain of forgettable concrete bridge. A plain and unforgettable concrete bridge. While the bridge has an official name, it is known more commonly in the area as Theorosa's Bridge. To many of our readers, the story of the bridge will be a common one, a story that we often refer to as Crybaby Bridge. But the reported phenomena here, as in so many other cases, appears to be so credible that it becomes hard to separate the fiction from the fact. There have been a number of stories circulating over the years which attempt to chronicle the events of this bridge. The oldest setting for the story in Kansas in the late 1800s, when settlers were passing through the area. According to one story, a wagon train was passing through when Indians attacked, and a settler's baby named Theorosa was stolen. Her mother's grief left the wagon train to search for their daughter. Legend has it that the ghost still roams the creek near the site of the bridge, her mournful voice still crying out, "Theorosa." Another story has Theorosa as the main character. In this version, she is a young woman who has an illegitimate baby, and to hide her shame, she throws the baby into the nearby creek and drowns it. Then, overcome by guilt, she also drowns herself. Another close version, Theorosa is standing on the banks of the creek when she is stabbed by the baby's father. The baby falls into the water and is carried away, and Theorosa dies a short time later, then returns to haunt the creek, searching for the lost child. And of course, the more contemporary version of the story has Theorosa as a local farm wife who has an illegitimate child and who throws the baby from the bridge. She follows the child into the river and then returns to haunt the place. The story also maintains that those who stand on the bridge and speak aloud that they are Theorosa's child will be attacked by the ghost as she rushes up from the river and tries to throw the person into the water below. Regardless of how the bridge came to be haunted, many people will assure you that it is certainly a ghostly place. There have been many reports over the years of eerie shapes, an apparition of a woman, floating balls of light, autos which mysteriously stall, cold breezes from nowhere, mournful voices in the darkness, and of course, the sound of a baby crying on the wind. The original wood and iron bridge, which spanned the river for decades, burned down in 1974, was rebuilt and then burned again 2 years later. The bridge was closed for nearly 15 years, but this never stopped the stories and encounters from being told. The bridge became a popular site, as many haunted places do, for parties and gatherings of teenagers, all hoping to experience the phantom. And if you believe the tales, many of them did. In 1991, the road was opened again. A concrete bridge was built to span the river. Stories continue to be told of Theorosa's ghost shaking cars, pushing them off the bridge, and frightening those who dare to enter her domain. Are the stories really genuine? Many people who live in the Wichita area believe they are, but who really knows? As with any haunted place that is open to the public, visitors are encouraged to visit the place for themselves. However, if you do, I implore you to treat the site with respect. Well, I sure hope you enjoyed the tales of being that this Halloween falls on Saturday, a few days away. I shall have another special Spooky Places Halloween night. Wishing you all a spooky night.